Welcome everyone this evening to the next edition of the Monday Majlis, and our guest is Youshaa Patel. And usually I give some sort of personal introduction to our guests, which I cannot do this time because that's the first time we are meeting with Youshaa. Of course, we spent some time on organizing this, so I have a very, very good impression of him. But first of all, the reason for him being here is this amazing book he wrote, and about which he will talk after having talked about his own journey and adventures. So I will give him immediately the word. Just maybe just before I will mention that next week we won't have a Majlis, but then we will have a very interesting one. Also with two scholars I never had the joy to meet in person yet, but I'm very much looking forward to do so. So I will put the invitation into the chat right now, and it will be on a modern topic, lens and Maya law on Islam, Arabic, and slavery in Omar ibn Said's America. So I hope you can join us there as well. You can register immediately here. Here is the link. So Youshaa, I will mute myself and delightedly listen to you.
Thank you so much, Isfan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit about, I guess, myself, my journey, and then also the subject of Muslim difference, which is sort of inspired by the recently published book, The Muslim Difference, that I'll speak of shortly. So I guess, first of all, I understand that it's part of a sunnah of this majlis to speak, tradition, as it were, to speak a little bit about oneself, and before entering into the sort of subject matter of the talk. So I'm happy to do that. In fact, in the preface to the book, I do actually give something of the journey that I took, a personal journey that I took in coming to the subject matter. So I'm going to start way back. It's not a story that I tend to tell often, and to be honest with you, it's difficult for me to speak about it. But and that perhaps explains why I don't speak about it often. But I think it does figure into the journey that I've taken into this field, into the subject. So I think I should share it with all of you. So I was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Actually, you probably couldn't tell from my accent, but I was born there and spent the first 6 or so years. And so going back to when I was about 5 years old, I was in primary one, I think we call it, in a school in Edinburgh. And I came home one day and I told my mother, I'm in a group all by myself. That's literally what I said, what I was recall saying, what I was told by my mother later, that what I said. But I was visibly upset, and my mother asked me, well, why? What are you talking about? What's happening? And so I said, everybody's in a reading group except for me. So she was immediately alarmed by what that meant, and so she came to school, I think the next day or at some point, to speak to the teacher to ask what was happening. And so Miss McGowan's was her name. She went on to say that students are placed in reading groups. So if you imagine a classroom of 20 students, each being placed in sort of a group of 3 or 4 other students, sort of with desks kind of in a square or in a circle, however you want to speak of it. However, she had chosen to place me in a group all by myself. So everyone else had a group and I didn't. So I visibly felt excluded. At 5 years old, I didn't understand necessarily the benefits of being in a reading group, but I didn't like feeling alone. So my mother, immediately was alarmed. It so happened I was the only person of color in the classroom. I was the only person who identified as Muslim. And having had some experiences in the past, my mother saw that this wasn't, something was fishy here. So she confronted the teacher, even though she was 5 foot tall, or maybe less than 5 foot tall. She was never afraid to sort of speak her mind, and told her that this is not appropriate, because school is not only a place to learn, it's also a place to where socialization takes place, right? You develop a sense of identity. Of course, I didn't understand those things at 5 years old, but she, having been a former teacher herself, did. Ms. McGowan, though, affirmed, or sort of asserted that this pedagogy was appropriate, and that I should not be interacting with the other students and reading groups, which was strange. My mother then, seeing that she was not getting much traction, went to the administration of the school itself, complained, said this practice is discriminatory. They too did not agree, and defended the teacher's ways and pedagogical strategies. That was actually a tipping point for my parents and my mother in particular. And some other incidents had taken place, not with me, but with my mother in particular. And that moment served as a decision to actually leave the United Kingdom and travel to the United States, hoping that we would not have encounters like that, at least in school and other institutions. So that explains the sense that at a very young age, I felt different. I felt different, and it's something that I was very conscious of at a very young age. So this is before I had any intention of pursuing academia, of course, and a scholarship. So fast forward about 20 years. I'm now in Chicago. I've graduated from the University of Michigan, where I was initially pre-med, and then dropped that to major in economics so I could make a lot of money. And I'm now working as a management consultant in Chicago at a mosque, attending the Friday prayers. And the khatib, or the one delivering the sermon, and this is in the early 2000s, after 9/11, declares that Muslims must be different, in very categorical, clear terms. And sort of it captured my attention as someone sitting in the mosque. I was curious as to see, well, how would he sort of justify this with Islamic scripture or tradition or whatever? And he cited a hadith of the Prophet in Arabic, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum," or whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. He then proceeded to cite other hadiths pertaining, for example, growing the beard, dressing in a particular way, how one styles one's hair. And of course, as someone who sort of followed the Sufi path, and he also spoke of matters of character and what we might call technologies of the self. So in this way, a Muslim ought to be visibly different, but also different in terms of how he or she comports him or herself. So what struck me from that sermon was that there wasn't much cited by way of the Quran, and most of the proof texts, as it were derived from the hadith literature. So so that moment sort of stuck in my mind. And then about a year or two later, I got bored with corporate America. I wasn't motivated, I realized, by making a lot of money as I thought. And in one of my conversations with one of my supervisors, he says, "You just love to analyze things." So that kind of struck a chord with me. It's like, if I do really love to analyze things, then maybe I should go into academia. And I was interested in matters of religion and the humanities, and those are the courses that I remember recalling enjoying the most as an undergraduate. So I decided, well, why not pursue religious studies, which brings together a lot of the subjects that I was interested in, such as existentialism and philosophy and religion and Islamic studies, which I kind of had just begun to sort of explore. And then, I was fortunate. I took some courses at the University of Chicago with John Wood and Tahir Qutbuddin, who's now here at Oxford. We actually saw each other for the first time in about 20 years, just the other day. Serendipitously ran into one another. But she was one of my first professors within the field of Arabic studies, Islamic studies at the University of Chicago, and helped me to apply to graduate programs in the field. I was accepted into Duke University, where Bruce Lawrence and Ibrahim Musa sort of led the program in Islamic studies, but that also gave me an opportunity to work with Carl Ernst, Leela Prasad, who's also in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke and president-elect of the AAR, and others like Omid Safi and Miriam Cook. So that took me into my sort of graduate program. And then one day I was taking a course in Islamic law with Professor Ibrahim Musa, and I had to pick a subject for my term paper. And I recall that incident in at the mosque in Chicago about the idea of Muslims being different, and it struck me as an interesting subject. So I looked to see what had been written on it, and I could only find just a couple of articles. One by Ignat Goldziher, written over 100 years ago. And then another article by M.J. Kister called La Tashabbuh, or Do Not Assimilate. And those were interesting articles, but it revealed to me that there was a lot more that could be written. And so I wrote my term paper on the subject, and then eventually decided when it came time to choose a dissertation that this would be a subject that would be interesting and I think fertile ground for me to make a contribution. I remember still feeling insecure about it. So I had a conversation with Michael Cook at Princeton, whom I visited at some point in the mid-2000s. And when I shared with him my ideas for doing this as a dissertation topic, he said, he gave me a destructive image, saying that it would be like throwing a brick into a large window, which that image struck me, and it confirmed that this was in fact a good subject to choose for my dissertation, be a little destructive. And that's what I did. So wrote the dissertation. I went to Damascus, where I did a lot of field work, and graduated, and eventually took up a position at Lafayette College, where I am now, which is in Easton, Pennsylvania, on the eastern border of Pennsylvania, not too far from New Jersey, where I live. And the book that you sort of that I have in front of me. Here you go. Is based, or at least inspired by the dissertation, although it goes much farther historically and conceptually than the dissertation does. So that, in a nutshell, is how I came to do what I do, and the subject matter in particular of Muslim difference and how it connects to my own personal journey. So I don't know if you have any follow-up questions before I actually get into the subject matter. I'm open to answering them.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's not questions really, but I just want to thank you for what you said. It's always moving what we hear, very often moving what we hear in this first part, and it was very moving. And it was also very interestingly structured, how you first mentioned how you were differentiated and how you learned later that you should be different. So that, and then yeah, so thank you, and also thank you, I would like to thank your mother for what she did. That was, yeah, okay.
Yeah, mothers are wonderful. So anyway, yes, I can share with you the Goldziher article, Theodore. I'm happy to do that. Let's see. I'm going to share a screen.
By the way, two of these scholars were also Hungarian. Goldziher, of course, but also I learned from Bruce Lawrence when he was here that he was very proud to be of Hungarian ancestry.
Oh, that's great. Yes, he did visit Exeter actually not too long ago. That's true. He was had very positive things to say about his experience. I remember during a conversation we had. So this is the cover of the book, which is sort of inspiration for this subject, for the talk that I'm about to give today, the Muslim difference. And then for those of you that can read Arabic, you'll notice that the hadith that I cited earlier is in red, placed just below the the title, the Muslim difference, appropriately, I think. Let's see. Let me move forward. Oh, there we go. Okay, use my cursor. So I'm going to begin with a quote of a famous European Muslim, perhaps one of the most famous European Muslims in the 20th century, Muhammad Asad. He wrote in an early publication of his, if I'm not mistaken, it's his first publication, Islam at the Crossroads, the imitation individually and socially of the Western mode of life by Muslims is undoubtedly the greatest danger for the existence, or rather the revival, of Islamic civilization. So a dramatic statement, for lack of a better word. He then goes on to cite this particular hadith that I had mentioned, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum," whoever imitates a people becomes one of them, as I guess an Islamic proof text for this view. And this statement was delivered the previous statement shortly after the fall of the Caliphate in 1924, and before World War II. And for him, the idea of the idea of Islamic civilization and the European civilization being an object of emulation and imitation sort of loomed large in the horizon at that particular time. And so it does reflect something of the historical moment as well. And also a young Muhammad Asad, he was born in 1900, to think about the kind of cultural interaction of these two civilizations. So this is the hadith he cites, which is collected by Abu Dawood, but many others as well, such as the Musannaf of Abdul Razak and the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He goes on to say about this particular hadith, a brief commentary that I'll share with you. Quote, "This well-known prophetic tradition is not only a moral admonition, but also an objective statement of fact. In this case, the fact of the inevitability of Muslims being assimilated by any non-Muslim civilization which they imitate in its external forms." So to unpack that a little bit, he's saying that the hadith is both descriptive and prescriptive. On the one hand, the hadith, whoever imitates a people becomes one of them, is describing a social phenomenon that, imitation, as it were, is a path to belonging and becoming, of feeling a sense of solidarity with whatever community or whichever people that you're emulating. From his perspective, and he's drawing, as I'll share, drawing from a long tradition, it is also prescriptive. It is not only describing social facts that happen in the world, but it is also prescriptive in the sense that it's announcing or an admonition. It is a warning of the Prophet Muhammad to believers to be careful, as it were, of whom they imitate. Otherwise, they will, as it were, become one of them. Them here is vague. Who is them? So the upshot of this for Muhammad Asad, in this sort of the danger of imitation, is that the solution is that, quote, "A Muslim must live with his head held high. He must realize that he's distinct and different from the rest of the world, and he must learn to be proud of his being different. He should endeavor to preserve this difference as a precious quality and pronounce it boldly to the world instead of apologizing for it and trying to merge it into other cultural circles." So this is a statement of an affirmation of Muslim identity. It certainly, I think, embeds within it anxieties over colonialism, and it's a declaration of the importance of difference, and Muslim difference and Muslim religious difference in particular. One could even use the word pride, and it wouldn't be incorrect, as he has to be proud of his being different. So this idea of being different is the sort of conceptual fulcrum of the book, and the idea of being different is we don't want to, and I'm going to read briefly here. One might dismiss Muhammad Asad as a provincial Muslim, quote unquote, fundamentalist who sees the world in stark black and white hues. But this portrayal is a gross mischaracterization of Assad, a habitual boundary crosser. Born into an Orthodox Jewish family, Leopold Weiss converted to Islam when he was 26 years old, becoming Muhammad Assad. He experienced firsthand the radical transformation of leaving the fold of one people and entering the fold of another, becoming, quote unquote, one of them. So he, in fact, had spent some time consorting with royalty, an adventure documented in his widely acclaimed autobiography, The Road to Mecca, where he stayed in Arabia. But he also spent time traveling across 4 continents, from his birthplace in Ukraine to Vienna, Berlin, Jerusalem, Mecca, Pakistan, New York, Morocco, and finally to Granada, Spain, where he is buried. A linguophile, Assad gained competence in at least 8 languages: Polish, Aramaic, Hebrew, German, English, French, Arabic, and Persian. And due to his role in founding the nation of Pakistan, Assad was chosen to represent his adopted country at the United Nations in 1951, an honor that figured into Austria's decision after his death to name the square adjacent to the United Nations building in Vienna, Muhammad Assad Platz. So this is here today and exists today. And although Muhammad Assad stressed the value of maintaining distinctive styles of Muslim dress, Assad usually dressed in European attire, as you can see here. He was thus perceived by some as the ultimate liminal figure. Quote, he was one of us and one of them. So the space of contradiction between Assad's spiraling manifesto against imitation, which drew clear lines between East and West, and the person of Assad, whose life was defined by crossing them, furnishes an appropriate point of departure for this talk, right? So when we're talking about Muslim difference, we're always already speaking about the complexities, ambiguities, and paradoxes of identity. This is, I think, embodied very much in the figure of Assad, but also in the narratives and the historical moments that I do explore in the book. So what I want to do now is speak briefly about imitation, because it is something that is connected very much to this idea of Muslim difference. But I think taking a step back and thinking about imitation and the role that it has in sort of shaping society, self, culture, even politics is worthwhile. And you can sort of see here in this photo a bunch of copycats. So one of the things that imitation tells us, or reminds us, is that human beings are social animals, right? So much of who we are is defined by our interaction with others, which are connections with others, our sense of belonging. And this is one of the intellectual, or at least the facets of this subject that also attracted me. It's sort of insights into the human, right? The humanistic dimension, or the humanities more broadly. So the key term here that I've sort of alluded to in the hadith, right, and in the subject matter that I'm going to speak of, is called tashabbuh in Arabic. Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. It's a 5th form term, so it implies some level of self-reflexivity, but it also is it has a robust and expansive semantic field that goes beyond imitation. And I want to sort of just consider it here, because you always have these dilemmas of translation. But I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind that even though I often use the word imitate, that other times, other terms are also appropriate for referring to this term, such as mimesis, simulation, assimilation, and resemblance. So it has a capacious sort of semantic field that allows us to translate it in many different ways. And I'll sort of vacillate between a few different terms as translations, but also use the Arabic as well. But this is a key term here, and it's a term that we should keep in mind, because it became sort of a shorthand way for Muslim elites, Muslim scholars, to speak about the idea of being different by simply mentioning this term. So there's one figure that I speak of in my book at length. There are a number of figures, but he's one of the figures. His name is Najmuddin al-Ghazi, who lived in Ottoman Damascus. He died in 1651. And he wrote extensively on the subject of tashabbuh. He defined it as, quote, human seeking, sometimes by artifice or deceit, to be a likeness of the imitated, shib'a mutashabbah bi. Shib'a mutashabbah bi, which is interesting, to become a likeness of the imitated. And, is there sort of a gap between the imitation and the original that can never be overcome? That somehow is implied in his definition, which I appreciate. But this is his definition of this term, Arabic term, and that I think is worth keeping in mind. And I think there's a parallel here that we can at least draw, even though I'm kind of crossing across time and place. I do think it's useful sometimes to draw parallels to not only talk about Muslims or analyze Muslims, but actually to think with Muslims. And I emphasize the preposition here, with, as thinkers and as philosophers and as theorists in their own right. And I want to draw a parallel here between how a couple of 20th century thinkers, as it were, thought about mimesis. And Walter Benjamin, for example, described mimesis as to become and behave like something else. Michael Taussig, anthropologist, thought of mimesis as to explore difference, yield into and become other. So this idea of mimesis, I think, parallels that of Ghazi's different definition of tashabbuh, as thinking about this process of as a technology of the self. So tashabbuh we can think of as a transformative technology of the self. And I think sort of these other definitions of mimesis help to illuminate this idea, and also helps us to appreciate how imitation then is a form of subject formation, right? It's a form of self-cultivation. So other, themes that resonate with this idea of imitation and tashabbuh, and that help to, or at least that excited me about the subject, is that it draws into sort of the central view relations between self and other, which I don't have to tell any of you that it remains an enduring and important subject today, especially and certainly with regard to religious communities. It also ties together other themes of becoming, right, and belonging and identity as sort of all happening within a, as it were, a singular kind of process, and I think is very capacious for thinking about how human beings become who we are. The hadith in particular, man tashabbaha bi qawmin fahuwa minhum, whoever imitates a people becomes one of them, ties all of these concepts together, and which helps to explain why it's the potent hadith, and why it has endured as an important text of the Prophet for Muslims, past and present. And of course, when you think of imitation and you think of difference and you think of self and other, it also brings into central view the relationship between religion and culture. So when we're talking about subjects such as imitation, we're always already not only talking about matters of religion, we're also already talking about matters of culture. So this is another, I think, thematic intersection that I think makes this subject matter fascinating. So now, kind of, since we have a brief kind of linguistic understanding of this term tashabbuh, and we've thought a little bit about the kind of idea of imitation, I want to talk briefly about imitation or tashabbuh with a normative Islamic framework, right? So the place within Islamic doctrine, Islamic discourse. So I've kind of drawn a sort of a simple schematic here to think about imitation, between good and bad imitation. So within normative Islam, there are a couple of terms that can at least relate to this idea semantically of imitating or emulating or following. One is ittiba' as-sunnah, at least within the Sunni tradition, and the other is taqleed. And they generally, at least certainly ittiba' as-sunnah, and often taqleed, have a positive connotation. They indicate positive forms of imitation or emulation. Taqleed in modernity has gotten something of a bad rap, and that's where the asterisk is there. But within Islamic legal circles, Taqlid, the idea of following or adhering to a particular school of law, which generally viewed as a good thing if you're not a mujtahid imam, if you're not one of the masters of law from the sort of among the earliest generations, and help to institute a hierarchy and stability in the formation and development of Islamic law. Tashabbuh, however, as a term, generally speaking, began to connote a negative connotation. It was a bad form of imitation. It's a kind of imitation that you shouldn't be doing. And this is one of the ways I wish to distinguish it from these other terms here. So, to kind of connect it, this idea of imitation and difference, there's a little kind of a schematic here. Again, tashabbuh is an Arabic term, connoted a bad form of imitation, which, if you kind of flip it, it connotes the idea of being different. If you're saying do not imitate, do not emulate this group or this practice, you're implicitly endorsing or exhorting, followers to be different. And that, in fact, is what we see in Islamic scripture and tradition. And there are many ahadith, for example, that use the phrase "do not imitate," but also use the phrase like "be different" or "do the opposite." Khalifu, mukhalafa. So this is how we can conceptually tie together this idea of imitation or emulation and difference. And sometimes sociologists speak of this dyad of similarity and difference. And that's a very kind of parallel sort of dyad or binary, even though I don't like the word binary, but a binary framework of thinking about this. So as a result of this, admonition of the Prophet, what emerged across time and place, and I have to rush through this, is the development of a literary genre that I call the Treatises against imitation. So many students of Islam are familiar with the Kutub al-Bid'ah, that was that Maribel Fierro had drawn attention to many years ago. The tashabbuh is in many ways a parallel concept as a way of maintaining orthodoxy and stability in Islam, but not through innovation, but through imitation. So bid'ah can be translated as a reprehensible form of innovation or reprehensible or heretical innovation. We can translate or tashabbuh or look at it as a reprehensible form of imitation or a heretical form of imitation as an alternative way. Many of these treatises were written across a range of geographic locales, including the Levant, Arabian Peninsula, Europe, West Africa, North Africa, South Asia. Authors include some famous figures from the Mamluk periods, as Ibn Taymiyyah and Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, but also the Ottoman period, Najmuddin al-Ghazi, and then, of course, the modern period, Usman bin Fodio, Qadi Muhammad Tayyib, Muhammad Asad, Ahmed al-Ghumari, who lived in India, West Africa, North Africa, Europe. And most treatises were composed in Arabic, but also treatises written in Ottoman Turkish, Urdu, and English. And some of these Arabic texts have been translated as well into other languages. Most of these treatises, and this is an interesting fact, were composed after European colonialism. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Even though this doctrine has its origins in Islamic scripture going back over a millennium, most treatises against imitation were not written, were not composed until after European colonialism. Only a handful were written before it. And I think this speaks to the trauma and the anxiety that European colonialism affected upon so much of the quote-unquote Muslim world, right? A term that I think is problematic, but I'm going to use here for matters of simplicity. And even though my book does kind of speak to this, another book could be written. So for those of you that are seeking a dissertation topic, you have one. Now, just to, this was a point I want to make, not because of the current conflict happening right now in Gaza, but because this is just a fact that within Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, you have a parallel concept called Hukkat HaGoy, referring to the laws and customs of the Gentiles. And it's inspired by Leviticus 18:3, you shall not follow their laws. So a book on the subject, on the idea of Jewish difference, was published about 10 years ago by Beth Berkowitz, who teaches at Barnard. in New York City. A fantastic book that was an inspiration for my own book. So for those of you that are interested in reading the parallel concept of within Jewish literature, also goes from late antiquity all the way to modern times. I recommend that book. It's a nice pairing with my own book if you're interested in the subject of how Jews conceptualize difference and how it manifested itself, in particular through rabbinic law. So there's a sort of ironic, or at least similarity here, in that there are doctrines within both Islam and Judaism on the importance of being different, and visibly different in particular. Now, what I want to do is kind of also, I'm speaking about difference, and difference. I also want to sort of assert that based on my research, this doesn't imply that Muslim identity is intrinsically oppositional. That would be a wrong and incorrect conclusion that some people actually make based on this doctrine. That is not the case. One has to look at the subject contextually and holistically, which is what I do in the book. But it would be a mistake to conclude that, which is with these emphases on being different, on being visibly different, that somehow Muslims were intent on being oppositional in a kind of very aggressive or in a very kind of expansive way. But that's not, in fact, the case. And it's much more complex and nuanced than that. And so I also want to keep that in mind. Just to kind of speak to this in a little more detail. And when we look at alterity, right, otherness, constructions of otherness within Islam, and I think within most religions, it is a continuum. It is not a black and white, simply self and other. So we can think, in simple terms of alterity as a couple of useful terms, as having other, proximate others, the near other, and as it were, the distant other. And of course, various others, as it were, religious others, non-religious others, will fall somewhere on the spectrum. It can also move and change with time and place, right? But this is important to keep in mind, that Muslim constructions of alterity were always along a continuum, right? Just to take one example, the Quran portrays the Ahl al-Kitab as the proximate other, generally speaking. Yes, there are critiques. Yes, there are critiques of Christians. There are critiques of Bani Israel, right? But generally speaking, the very phrase Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book, right? And remember, the Quran refers to itself as a kitab, speaks to the fact, or is a bridge term. And here, the image of the bridge. I like that. But anyway, speaks to the idea of the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, Jews and Christians, and in different historical moments, others, as the proximate other, as the near other, generally speaking. And I think this is important to keep in mind. As Abdul Hakim Murad cheekily puts it, we can share bread and a bed with fellow scripturaries, and there can be close neighborliness and conviviality, right? So this is, I want to highlight the fact that otherness and alterity within Islam is not a zero-sum game. It is not just black and white. It is a spectrum. And then we need to keep that in mind when thinking about the subject of difference, because sometimes it is forgotten. Another kind of point, point of evidence in defense of this idea is Shah Wali Allah of Delhi, and his masterpiece Hujjatullah al-Baligha, composed in the 18th century, writes, and this is referring not to Jews and Christians, right, but to pre-Islamic Arabs. The Prophet had been sent to a people in which a remnant of the rightly guided practice still remained. There wasn't any sense in changing this and altering it. Rather, it was necessary to affirm it, since it would be easier for them. I mean, what he's saying is that, look, even before Islam came onto the scene, there were ethics, rituals, and practices that aligned with Islamic ethics, as it were. And he even goes as far as to demonstrate that the foundations of the 5 pillars, right? And 5 pillars, I understand, is kind of a Sunni construction of ritual, right? But prayer, fasting, making the Hajj pilgrimage, I'm blanking. Tawheed, affirming the oneness of God. These were all in place before Islam came onto the scene. Islam simply built on these foundations. And so the key here, from a historical perspective and also from the perspective of understanding Islamic scripture and tradition, is that there's both continuity and rupture. It's not purely rupture, not purely continuity. But this is the point that I think Wali Allah was trying to make, that even with, quote unquote, in the period of ignorance, jahili, right, translated frequently as ignorance, the reality, from his perspective, writing in the 18th century, was that there was still continuity with the past. And there was a landscape of sharedness that Muslims had with these who are for the most part pagans. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when once again thinking about the subject of difference. And this is, I think, implied and implicit as well in the discourses that I studied, that I examine in the book. So, now we can kind of get to some more kind of concrete questions. What practices does tashabbuh include? Right? I've spoken kind of abstractly about this idea of imitation, about difference, but what are we speaking of here? So in my research, I've kind of distilled kind of the practices into a few categories. Here's what we can speak of with regard to the exhortations in these hadith traditions to be different. Manner of ablution, prayer, including the call to prayer, the adhan, manner of fasting, greeting formulas such as how you say hello and how you greet somebody, holidays and festivals, participation in holidays and festivals, especially those of non-Muslims and others, funerary rites, sartorial matters such as dress and hairstyle, and even manner of eating, such as whether you eat your right hand or your left hand, etc. So this is a distillation of many of the practices, at least that we find in the hadith traditions, and then we would find in later Islamic tradition. Now, in modernity, these expanded. So, for example, one author writing in mid-20th century, I think it was Egypt or Syria, one of the two. I'm sort of a little fuzzy on which location. But anyway, wrote about the dilemmas of the intermingling of the sexes, that men and women were intermingling too much. And this is cultural borrowing from the West. Another figure wrote about photography. Photography is a dangerous sort of invention that threatens to, as it were, sort of ruin the sanctity, the mechanical reproduction of living creatures, ruining the sanctity, as it were, associated with them. So it expanded in modernity to other subjects, but this kind of gives you a nuts and bolts idea of the kinds of things that early Muslims, at least, and to a large degree, medieval Muslims were also thinking about by way of how Muslims should visibly manifest their difference in public life. These are a couple of ahadith, right, that pertain to the beard in particular. So do not imitate the polytheists, grow your beards and trim your mustaches. Another one is dye your beards, be different from the Jews and Christians. And these are two hadith that we can find in sort of authoritative collections, at least within a Sunni tradition, about the importance of growing the beard. One thing of note is that the idea of growing the beard is positioned as a practice of difference, of distinction, of visible distinction here by the Prophet. Later, the beard would kind of accrue additional meanings, but I think this speaks to the importance of how at least the partisans of hadith saw, or at least saw the importance of identifying Muslims visibly, or at least creating a visual kind of landscape, a distinctively Islamic visual landscape that could be legible both to fellow Muslims and to non-Muslims. And then a beard is one way of also constructing masculinity, for that matter. So this is just a couple of examples of hadith traditions that speak to this doctrine that would, or at least later become a doctrine, and the idea of expressing Muslim difference. So you have an idea of what we're talking about here. And what I do in the book is I try to kind of think this through, like what's happening here, like why is the beard important, right? And for that matter, there are a number of other practices that one would read and like, these seems really small. One practice that M.J. Kister, for example, in his article dwells upon, in fact, half of his article is on the subject, is shoes. Muslims wearing shoes during prayer. So one hadith states that do not wear shoes when entering a mosque, because that's what the Jews do. That's what the Arabian Jews do. So to differentiate Muslim ritual practice, and in particular comportment within a sacred space, the Prophet allegedly encouraged Muslims to wear their shoes in the mosque. Now, anyone that's been to a mosque would know that this is strange. In fact, I was speaking with someone today. It's like, this is a strange hadith, because in most mosques, you're supposed to take off your shoes, not wear them. So, it's an interesting subject to think about and to talk about historically. But this is another sort of topic that we find in the Hadith tradition. So why this apparent concern with wearing shoes, growing the beard, parting the hair? One of the theories, or at least the explanatory models that was helpful for me to thinking this through, is what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. So in a nutshell, what the narcissism of small differences is that groups or people or individuals that are otherwise alike, that are otherwise similar, sort of, as it were, focus on certain small differences to set themselves apart from one another. And I thought this is a compelling explanation for helping to explain why these particular topics, these particular forms of comportment were selected, as it were, as being important and significant. So in many ways, when we're talking about difference, we're also then talking about similarity beneath the surface, or at least on the surface. And I thought that was helpful for thinking through this subject. Another thing that I wondered is, why does the doctrine or discourse of imitation, reprehensible imitation or difference, emphasize Muslim physical appearance? And I think this subject is important today because some of the controversies of Muslims in Europe and France and elsewhere involve the kind of aesthetics of Muslim practice, right? Wearing a headscarf, wearing an abaya, whether you can pray in public, right? And bowing, at least the Muslim ritual prayer, because it creates a particular aesthetic landscape. So I think this is important, at least to think about. And so to quote myself, not narcissistically, but because I think at least it helps to demystify this question, is that, quote, being Muslim cannot be reduced exclusively to a private, interior, abstract, disembodied experience. And this is how many of us experience religion today in modernity. Rather, it encompasses a public, exterior, material, and embodied dimension as well. And so this was something that I argue happened quite early within Islam, the development and the importance of developing a public face, as it were, that helps to explain why Muslim elites in particular encouraged ordinary believers and fellow elites, for that matter, to embody their faith and to visibly embody their faith, to establish a particular Islamic public. Now, what types of social differences does tashabbuh govern? This is kind of the last question that I want to address before I sort of conclude. Right, so we're talking here about certain practices, but really, who are Muslims encouraged to imitate or not imitate? And I want to draw from a particular text to do this. So even though the discourse of Muslim difference focuses on Muslim, non-Muslim relations, the reality is, when you look, and this is kind of was surprising, is that it also governs relations, as it were, or mediates relations between Muslims and other Muslims, right? So it's not just about inter-religious difference, it's also about intra-religious difference. And I guess on this point, I want to emphasize, or at least I should say, that when doing the research, I was surprised to find very few traditions within 12 Hadith collections with this vocabulary of difference. Very, very few. It doesn't mean that 12 Shi'is are not, wasn't important or of value to differentiating themselves visibly, publicly, sometimes clandestinely. But the vocabulary that emerged on here that I'm discussing was distinctively Sunni. And that was something surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that in the research. But when looking at the vocabulary that was being employed here, and this vocabulary of sort of reprehensible form of imitation, tashabbuh, I argue in the book that it's something that is distinctively Muslim. Not to say that it never comes up in Shi'i traditions, or it does, but not nearly with the frequency that it does among Sunni elites. Now, with that in mind, what you see here is how one figure, the figure I mentioned earlier, Najmuddin al-Ghazi of Damascus, speaks about the importance of difference, right? So, in other words, what kinds of social groups living within Islamic society should be imitating and should not be imitating one another? In other words, how can we, what kinds of lines of difference are important for Muslim elites to enforce? And so on the right side, you see what I call bad imitation. And on the left side, you see good imitation. And Ghazi had a bit of a more expansive imagination of the term than many others, in that he saw tashabbuh, right, imitation, as something that could be good or bad. And so the term didn't have an exclusively negative valence for him. Rather, there were some categories of humans and non-humans that were good to imitate. And there were other categories that shouldn't be imitated. So, for example, he argued that, generally speaking, based on Hadith traditions, Arabs should not be imitating non-Arabs. Men should not be imitating women, and vice versa. So, gender. Scholarly elite should not be imitating commoners. However, commoners should be imitating, or ordinary believers should be imitating scholars and elites. Free persons should not be emulating or imitating slaves. And neither the other way around. So for him, tashabbuh, the idea of difference, was not merely about mediating relations between religious communities. This was about a much larger, I would argue, cosmological project, right? A hierarchical cosmology that translated itself into how different groups were arranged and ordered in an ideal Islamic society. And so this is the argument that I make in the book, that this subject of difference is much bigger and much more at least when thinking about religious difference within Islamic contexts, and in this particular doctrine in particular, it's helpful to think about it, and it's helpful to look at it within this larger social project. And that gets us into questions of intersectionality, which we certainly see. Say, for example, the beard is not merely about religious difference, it's also about masculine difference, right? So you have gender here figuring into the construction of Muslim difference. And that's something that I think is conceptually sort of helpful and important when thinking about Muslim difference. And I think the traditions here and the texts here and the schematic help to illuminate that. So, what are the Islamic rulings on tashabbuh for, the aspiring faqihs and lawyers here? Without going into expansive detail, I will say that it covers the range from everything from obligatory and fard, wajib, to illicit, haram, to illicit, mubah, detested, recommended. So when you look at sort of the legal literature on what kinds of practices are permitted and not permitted, you find a range of rulings. Many times jurists disagree on a particular ruling, whether it's permitted or impermissible. And I can't go into particular detail here, but at least for those of you that wish to know of this place within Islamic law, you can see that it's not a black and white issue. Like the concept itself, it's full of ambiguity and variety, or at least diversity, which I think is appropriate. Going back to the hadith. So that's it. That's all I have for you today. I've kind of just rushed through something of this doctrine and idea within Islamic thought. There's a lot more that can be said. In the book, I look at particular historical moments, such as Mamluk period and Ibn Taymiyyah, Najmuddin al-Ghazi, Muhammad Abdu in modern Egypt. So there I'm able to kind of go in a little bit more, delve into historical detail that I think is helpful. But hopefully this gives you a taster of what we're talking about here, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much, Youshaa. This was a fascinating talk, to the point that I think I will make it teaching material for MA students, on both for the content and the quality of the presentation. Just how, as a model to imitate, or to aspire to imitate. If you, I don't know how much time you have, but I guess we may have a quite long session of question and answer, I could fill easily up with my own questions the half an hour, but there will be lots of other people. So well, thank you again.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much, Isfan. One thing I should say, I think I have 10% battery left on my computer. So if I suddenly cut out,
okay,
I didn't vanish. I wasn't abducted, but my computer died, and unfortunately I forgot to bring my my plug, my Apple plug along. So I apologize for that.
I stopped the recording and then I let others go for their questions.
Okay.